Amongst many things, the COVID and lockdown crisis has challenged us emotionally and psychologically, in addition to all the physical challenges that we face. And many of us have had to deal with loss. At worst, loss of people close to us, and most of us are dealing with loss of business or loss of money, loss, of course, of a familiar life, loss of what makes us secure and what we take for granted in our everyday lives. There is a lot to learn from that, but if we don't process loss and grief fully, we never really benefit from the lessons we learn, and we struggle to move on. Tonight, I thought I'd screen an episode on grief, which helps us understand this important process, how to deal with it, and how to deal with it in others. Most of what I talk about on this show is ancient wisdom. It's not my own wisdom, but it's wisdom that I have acquired over the years from great masters in all the various philosophies and pursuits I follow that are generally all about the wisdom of different kinds that has been passed on to us since time immemorial. Of course, for me, astrology being the most important of those, more than 3,000 years old, containing a lot of the wisdom of the people who evolved it, not just their theories about the cosmos. But it's not really astrology that I want to talk about here today. It is, like as I've often had occasion to talk about on this show, I want to talk about some of the questions that plague us, that in the more modern, industrialized, kind of post-spiritual world that we live in, have become harder to answer. Questions that have become hard to answer and issues that have become harder to deal with because of our increasing independence from spiritual traditions and beliefs of the past. Whatever you might think about whether we should still be connected to spiritual traditions of the past, whether we should be following religions of people of the past, or any of those kind of things, that's not what I want to talk about at all. What I do want to talk about is that since we live in a world of so many different beliefs and ways of dealing with things, we often confronted by difficult situations because we don't know how someone else would be dealing with it. And the example that I'm really referring to is grief. Grief that comes from loss, from death. There are other losses, and there are other losses that cause grief, of course, but it's primarily death. And, you know, in a previous world or in a homogeneous culture, it's reasonably easy to understand how to talk about death and how to deal with death, and we're going to talk about that later on in this show, and what perhaps we can learn from ancient cultures and how they dealt with death. But the fact is that many of us don't know how to deal with someone else who has just suffered a loss, and many of us don't know how to confront that ourselves when we suffer a loss. And so I thought perhaps that same wisdom that gave great spiritual practices of the past could also enlighten us about how to think about and how to handle others when it comes to grief. Because, of course, one thing we all do know is that all those platitudes that people come up with after someone dies are well meant but not usually helpful. What platitudes do I mean? I mean things like when someone says he's in a better place right now, or now she's looking down on you and everything is fine, and all of those things that are designed to kind of make you feel better, but that don't. And that actually, for many people in a grieving situation, makes them feel even more isolated and more disconnected and alone. Because, of course, grief and loss produce the feeling of aloneness. And so things which don't approach the depth of their grief are going to make them feel alone. It's not whether those things are right or wrong, although it adds to it, because as I've said, we live in a world where you don't know what someone's belief system is, usually. And even if you do, about core things like death, like that, it's very unlikely that you would have the words to say something that is deeply meaningful in that situation, for all those reasons, including the bottom line fact that words don't cut it. Words basically can't heal a broken heart. So by trying and using words, as I've said, it makes the person sometimes feel even more broken or isolated, or also puts them in a situation of ultimately having to smile and nod and even end up comforting the person who says that to them. So all of that is not very helpful, because we don't need to say something when somebody dies. It's not really about the words. What it is about is actually true in many situations when we deal with someone else dealing with emotional challenges, and that is really just to be there, to listen, even to be silent. Sitting silently with someone who has suffered a loss is all that they really need, because it's also all that they can deal with. They don't want to have to engage in small talk. They don't want to have to look appreciative for the platitudes that you are offering, as well meant as they are. They don't want to have to do anything, and you certainly shouldn't be putting them into the situation where they would be doing those things, especially since the best thing to do when somebody dies might just be to sit there. More about that in a minute. So what we really need to do is to listen, to offer support just in the sense of love, and to say sorry, not to pretend that words make it better or it's all right, because it isn't. Just to say sorry. Sorry means I know that you're suffering. I'm sorry that you're suffering. There's nothing I can really do to make it better. So don't make it sound like there is. Rather just say sorry. I get it that you're in a painful place. Sitting quietly is all that they really need, and support in the practical sense. One of the things that has amplified the difficulty of dealing with death is the endless kind of bureaucratic and financial requirements that often kick in immediately after someone dies, and that occupy the survivor, the one or ones left behind. And while distractions might for a while help someone deal with something, probably not the best way to deal with something, but be that as it may, it often prevents a person from experiencing some of the closure or process that they need to in the early stages of understanding and grasping the loss that is happening. So for one of the best ways to be supportive of people who are experiencing grief and loss is to offer help for those small things, from the stuff of the administration of some of the bureaucracy itself to the most important mundane practical things, and that is cooking food and providing the family with food. When we look at traditions, the African tradition, the ancient traditions of the Jews and the Muslims from the Middle East, and reflecting ancient traditions all over the world, very often the way of dealing with death is for the survivors to sit together, the family to sit together and do nothing, to sit quietly in their grief, to let each other see their grief, not to try and hide it, and not to hide it in doing other things. One of the common Western approaches to dealing with grief is to get very busy, to bury yourself in work. And again, while in itself that isn't a harmful thing to do, it can prevent opportunities for proper processing or closure. So the sitting around in front of each other's grief allows others to come in and cook the food and provide the food and feed the cats and make sure that if there are any children, go to school and so on, and dealing with all those practical things is the most amazing support that you could offer to someone who is dealing with loss. And that's why traditional cultures are about that and about providing food. But for me, what's really important in all of that is that the showing of the grief, not the weeping and the wailing and the falling down type of showing. And sometimes that is part of the ritual of death and might be associated with the funeral. And rituals of death are very important. But just in the sense of, if you admit to your grief, you are going to more smoothly go into and through the process of having to deal with it. So that sitting together is a kind of admission and equalizing that we all face this and we're all dealing with loss. The first important thing in dealing with loss is allowing time to deal with the shock of it. In the early stages of learning about loss or death, we often are confused, we often feel a kind of a numbness, we often go through motions of acting as if everything is normal. We're not really in a situation where we can properly grasp or process what has happened. Loss is huge, especially of the loss of someone close to us. So what I'm really saying about that is that it's important to understand that in the early days of dealing with that loss, introspection and trying to deal with all the big issues is not going to work. Just like dealing with the small issues like the admin and the bureaucracy doesn't really work either. So it's important to really allow yourself to experience the shock, being gentle with yourself, allowing yourself time to realize this takes time to sink in. This is not the time to ask yourself the questions, how can this be? What did I do wrong? What should have? What shouldn't have? You're going to ask those questions, but it's to understand that that initial shock and numbness basically needs to wear off a little bit before you start asking yourself, how can I end this grief? The initial response, especially immediately after the grief and the shock, is as the pain starts coming to the surface, is to say, how can I get through this as quickly as possible, or how can I bring this to an end? And that is not a good question to ask, especially since pain exists for a reason. You know, physical pain is a way that your body warns you that you've got to do something about it, that you've got to handle it, and you've got to go through a process of healing it. If you ignore the physical pain, you do greater damage to your body, and that's the main reason why your body's telling you you've got that pain. You need to fix something before it all goes horribly wrong. So emotional pain exists for the same reason, and it's basically telling you you need to go through a healing process. You can't ignore this. You need to go through a healing process. So asking yourself how to end the grief or how to speed it up or anything like that is not a useful question, because it denies the fact that your body is telling you you need to put yourself through a process in order to come to a place of healing. Grief itself is chaotic, and once you've gone through that numbness, grief is alternatively overwhelming and calm and seemingly fine, and we experience fluctuations of emotion and guilt and depression and anger and all of those kind of things. And allowing space for yourself or for another person to go through a fluctuation of wildly different emotions is also normal. It's easy to judge people when that happens, and when they seemingly go through inappropriate emotions, when they seem to not be grieving. And we have to allow for the space that there is a very individualistic response to grief, and part of what it includes is a vast array of emotions coming like changed weather, often one after the other, or spells of one followed by spells of the other. So those kind of things we really just need to give a person space for, and not presume to understand or second guess or tell them what to do. We need to recognize their grief as unique, or your own grief, if that's what it is, as unique. When it comes to our own grief, we're often saying to ourselves, I should have done this, or why aren't I doing that? I should be crying. I should be feeling this. Why am I not feeling that? All of those things are useless questions once you understand that grief is unique and emotions come and go and fluctuate, and it's a long, slow process. It's really a lot slower than we allow ourselves to believe. The initial process is at the very, very least 7 days to kind of what I've spoken about, just to absorb that there's something going on. The process of alternating emotions, while is immediately in the process I've said, from extreme grief to not, can continue on and off for months and months, and emotions can suddenly overwhelm someone, and we need to give space for that and realize we shouldn't be thinking it's about time I moved on, it's about time they moved on. There's never about time for a very long time to come. It can take, especially for a close spouse, it can take a couple of years for those kind of things to recede enough into the distance that they're not overwhelming. So recognizing that grief is a unique emotional experience that someone needs to go through. We can't go through it forever. It does become self-indulgence. So grief and mourning do well to have some limits, but we need to understand that those limits are large. And so that's also why ritual and a ritualistic way of dealing with death can be so helpful. Whether it's the traditions of the family sitting together for a week or two after death, like I've said, or other rituals which help people go through a process, the famous wake of the Irish and perhaps others, and celebrations of life that happen, but all kinds of ritual allow people to structure and express. Expressing the mourning is so important as well, so that if there is a known safe space to express feelings, then you're going to be able to do it, and you can go through a process. So while on the one hand we recognize the necessity of the grief and we provide the space for that in ourselves or others, on the other hand we also try and eventually provide or create a process to go through which allows us to express that and have some kind of grieving ritual. Other ways can also be to express yourself otherwise. So part of the process can be to actually express yourself through artistic means, whether it's listening to music or reading things that are similar to the grief you're having, and allowing yourself to go through a process of beginning to try and understand it. So it's not through the initial stages of asking questions. It's a little bit later, once the acuteness of the grief has passed, that we can get to the phase of expressing ourselves other ways. The rituals and the processes after the loss itself can give us the space to express the grief. Later, we need to find meaning, because then eventually, to somewhat absorb all of this, we need to find meaning. And part of where to look for that meaning is through creativity and art, especially of others, but perhaps of your own as well. It's also challenging to deal with how do we deal with children and how do we explain death to children. And I think one of the most important things is that we need to be truthful with them, that we don't use euphemisms like he's gone to a better place or she's gone to sleep, and because those fire up children's imaginations and we don't want to leave things to their imagination. It's more useful to try and find plain language that they can understand. So we talk about how everything in nature does die, and nothing is forever, and we find ways appropriate to the age of the child to give examples about that. And it's obvious in nature, so nature's a great place to start with that. The most important thing is that if you're not clear about it, they're going to expect that person's return, or they're going to have some false ideas that you are contributing to. It's also important not to let them feel responsible, of course, for the death that you're explaining to them. So you put it in the context of nature. It's important to allow them to be open with their feelings, to let them be okay with being angry or crying, not to shoo them down, but just to say, sorry, I understand, those kind of things, to let them experience those emotions. We need also to come to a place of acceptance. Acceptance doesn't mean that it's now everything is fine and I've accepted it, and acceptance is not a permanent way of being. And it doesn't mean that everything's fine either. It doesn't mean that once you accept that you're going to be happy, or once you accept you're going to be how you were before you experienced the loss. The loss changed your life. The loss of a loved one changes the circumstances of the world, of the person left behind. And acceptance marks the understanding of that, the integrating that this is now part of my identity. It means that you're willing to move on without the other person, but doesn't mean you're imagining that other person never existed. The loss itself becomes part of your life. The loss itself is part of the experience of life. So acceptance is accepting that this empty space is now part of my life, and that experience that was is now part of my life, and the loss itself is part of my life. Because once we accept the loss itself, and once we understand that loss and absence are part of our lives, that allows us to start finding meaning and seeing a bigger picture of why loss is in our lives, or what loss can do for us. The meaning is not about what is the meaning of life after death. The meaning is about the life now. It's about living in the present. It's about accepting things. It's about understanding that loss is part of you, not something that is finished. And so we look for meaning. It causes us to look for meaning because spirituality is part of the human experience. It is part of human life. We seek to find meaning in things not just in the religious sense of the word, but because of the nature of our consciousness. So we seek to understand some truth in what is happening in the world all the time. Buddhism and Stoicism are examples of ancient philosophies which teach us about living in the present, which teach us about acceptance. In Buddhism, we learn that death is an unavoidable part of life. It's a natural part of life. In Buddhist, the core teachings are that the world is impermanent and the self is impermanent. Things are impermanent. So all suffering is caused by being attached to that which is impermanent. We attach ourselves to that which is impermanent. It disappears, a person or a thing, at some point, or it dies, and then we experience sorrow and loss. Whereas if we understand that something is impermanent from the beginning, we attach ourselves less and we experience less grief. But we must experience grief. It's not a thou should be doing this and I shouldn't be doing that. Grief, says Roshi Joan Halifax, is a pathway to transformation because it forces us to let go of what we had, and it forces us to let go of what we think we know. We think that we know that the world is like this and it's solid and it's real. And we think that what our senses tell us is true. And we think we are our ego. But all of that is really illusion because all of that is impermanent. So through grief, we experience the bitter truth that everything is impermanent. But once we really get that, once grief really makes us accept that, as painful as it is the discovery of a fundamental spiritual truth. And the experience of a fundamental spiritual truth can be profoundly transformative. It can lift us above our suffering and above our loss because it allows us to experience ourselves as part of the greater, as connected to the greater, as beyond the ego self, because the ego self is the illusion that is causing the grief in the first place. So grief is a necessary process. We shouldn't be distracting someone from it. We shouldn't be replacing it with platitudes. We should allow ourselves to go through a process where pain is acknowledged and accepted, where it causes us to seek and eventually find meaning, and to realize that once we understand the impermanence of everything, we are forced to live only in the present, and therein lies our eventual liberation. Learning from difficult experiences is, of course, always easier said than done. But compassion for ourselves and compassion for others makes it just that little bit easier. I'll see you again next week at the usual time.